We begin with breaking news out of Washington. President Obama has authorized the U.S. military to send up to 1,500 more troops to Iraq. That nearly doubles the current total of about 1,400 American forces that are currently on the ground. The Obama administration has repeatedly said none of the troops will take on a combat role and that they're instead there to advise and train Kurdish and Iraqi forces in the fight against ISIS. A militant group, of course, battling to take over large swaths of both Iraq and Syria to form an Islamic caliphate. This announcement comes shortly after President Obama met with members of Congress at the White House today to update them on the fight against the group. He has reportedly also requested an additional $5.6 billion to pay for munitions and other military requirements to combat ISIS. And in other Iraq-related news, we're now learning that over 600 American service members have reportedly been exposed to chemical warfare agents in the country since 2003. That's all according to defense officials who are now admitting that the Pentagon didn't offer sufficient tracking and treatment to those who may have been harmed by the chemical materials. This is all coming in the wake of a New York Times investigation that found at least 17 cases in which troops had encountered chemical weapons from the 1980s during their tours in Iraq. After that investigation, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel ordered an internal review of records in which soldiers were asked whether they had been exposed. Turns out there are 629 people who said yes. That number is much higher than what was previously thought. So how toxic is this exposure, and what does this mean for the U.S. as it gears up to put more boots on the ground? To talk more about that, I was joined earlier by Michael Shank, Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And I first asked him about President Obama's plan to deploy 1,500 additional troops to Iraq and what it means going forward.
I think he's going for it. He's launching a war that he still doesn't have congressional authority for. He's hoping to go to the Senate with new authorization for a war against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, but he still doesn't have authority. But this shows doubling down on sending troops in. Boots are going on the ground, and this is a full-fledged war for the White House.
And what we've heard from the Obama administration since this began really is that everything is under control. We have it under control. We know exactly what we're doing, even when, Kobani essentially, is at its crisis point. The Obama administration is saying it's not a problem. We're not worried about it. Does this prove it actually is a problem and they are worrying about it? I mean, where does this come from, this extra need of troops?
I think they're seeking every measure, whether it's airstrikes or sending troops. ISIS is gaining ground. They're taking more territory. They're taking more oil reserves. They're taking more water reserves. So if this is a fight we're losing, the U.S. is definitely losing. So they're all stops being pulled out for this. But what catastrophic news on the 600 troops front being exposed to chemical weapons.
Sure, and I do want to ask you about that because, I mean, this is serious stuff. Sarin and sulfur mustard. How would you describe the role these U.S. Military servicemen had? I mean, what were they doing? Were they transporting this weaponry? What was going on?
This is a quintessential story of our weapons, wherever they be, Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, being used either on our troops later or by our enemy/adversary on us. So Islamic State already has new chemical weapons caches in Iraq that they will likely use on us. Our troops being exposed to 2003 weapons when we helped Iraq in 1980 in the war with Iran for the next 8 years. These weapons get used on us later. So all the trafficking that we're doing of weapons to any of these countries inevitably gets used on us later.
And now the Pentagon is saying, okay, we're going to reach out to the veterans that have been exposed. We're really going to track them. We're going to help them.
Right.
But why do you think it took a New York Times investigation to really push them to actually compile this data? It's incredible.
It is shocking that as we approach Veterans Day, that we still aren't getting it right in terms of our treatment of veterans. And the suicides daily of veterans, quite high. PTSD among veterans, quite high. So Secretary Robert McDonald, who came from Procter & Gamble, is going to try as a CEO to kind of change the way in which we treat veterans, but we're still not treating our veterans right. And the numbers are only growing in terms of PTSD and exposure to chemical weapons.
It's truly tragic.
Yeah.
Aside from the problem of exposure, we have the other issue, which is these weapons are still there, and they are now not in the control of the U.S. And the servicemen who were once overseeing them. They are in the control of ISIS. Do we know at this point whether they've been used?
Well, reporters are still determining. They know that Islamic State has the facilities, and it's just a matter of time. They said they were used in Kobani, possibly. We have very little ability to get in scientists with the UN to track use in Iraq now by Islamic State. But ultimately, these are the costs that we don't calculate when we think about war. Cheney thought we could go into Iraq for $60 billion. When Joe Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes say that this war and the war in Afghanistan will cost $4 to $6 trillion, these are the costs they're talking about. When our vets come home and suffer incredible burdens, either physical or psychological, these are the costs that we need to look at.
And do you think this revelation will change the scope of the argument when talking about sending more troops now to Iraq? Do we think about these long-term effects?
We don't seem to learn. We made the same mistake when we funded the rebels with our weapons that were used against us in Pakistan. We did it in Syria. We did it in Iraq. We don't seem to learn. I don't think it will change the calculus.
Oh, that's unfortunate. An unfortunate assessment. All right, that's all we have time for. But Michael Shank of the Friends Committee and also a professor at George Mason University. I got that by memory. Okay, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.